What has revolutionized aviation at every level, from helicopters to drones, jumbo jets, and personal aviation? The answer is going to blow you away. We will reveal this on this episode of Aviation Intrigue.
This is aviation intrigue.
Elaine, you got me stumped. I'm trying to think what has revolutionized across the board because my first thought was maybe it is like jet engines or some other fuel, but that favorably affects one, but not everything. So I am trying to think. I'm not sure something is coming to my mind right away.
Yeah, I was going to say they've invented a jet engine for your Cirrus, but that's they make their own jet for that, so it's not quite that. It's something a little smaller, and it's something that actually makes flying convenient for everyone. Like I mentioned in the opening, from drones to jumbo jets.
Flying convenience. So maybe it has something to do with the cockpit design, maybe the seats, something like that, perhaps.
No, they haven't invented a way to make recliner seats in the cockpit, so I know that's on your wish list. But this is something, again, it's a little smaller yet. And think about all the books and things that you had to carry before this came along. You don't have to do that anymore.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So I'm thinking now that if even if I had this vision of captains, the airline captains from way back when, they always carried this big giant bags. And even when I started learning to fly way back when, 30 plus years ago, is that we had to carry a lot of maps, so binders, and we in the previous episode we talked about sectional maps. Is that kind of where we are headed to?
That's something that we don't really have to do anymore thanks to this item. Yeah, you mentioned the airline pilots used to walk around with wheeled suitcases full of all the paper charts they'd have to carry on their long trips. And in personal flying, we had to at least carry a big flight bag that had some books, some manuals, a bunch of maps that we needed. And there's a reason why we don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah. Speaking of that, there is regulation that even today requires us to have a map, sometimes a map and a backup map that we have to have just in case the first one fails. And that's how we navigate. At least that's how we used to navigate. Even now, we may have to carry that. I know a lot of flight students do that.
Definitely. They are still using paper maps in a lot of cases, but this particular item, again, can be your backup, can be maybe something you rely on. And we talked in the last episode about GPS. This helps you use GPS.
Okay, so some kind of a portable device.
You're getting there.
Okay. Is it an iPad?
Is the iPad. And there are so many other uses that we'll discuss in the next segment. And this is something that has, again, revolutionized flying. And believe it or not, next time you get to peek in your airline cockpit, the pilots are probably holding iPads.
Interesting. Let's talk more about it. So, if you're driving a car, you rely on the GPS or some built-in device, but it is possible for you to have your phone, your smartphone, or some sort of portable device, and typically you put it on your dashboard for the maps and stuff like that. So we have the same thing in aviation.
Yes, this is something that has become so common. I believe that the vast majority of pilots flying all different aircraft are using at least an iPad, or an iPhone, or something very similar. In fact, I believe that the iPad is the most popular, and we'll talk about why. And there are many, many uses for this in flying. We mentioned GPS. You can carry all of your charts that you used to carry around in a suitcase or a big bag in that device, and there's a lot more that you can do with it.
Yeah, so now it makes sense, the question you asked, because if you're using an iPad to fly, to navigate with for the maps and everything else you mentioned, that is something that you can use all the way from personal flying all the way to airlines, because I believe airline pilots now routinely use iPad or some kind of a tablet to navigate, and it's become part of the routine.
Yes, a lot of the major airlines actually issue iPads, and there's different sizes, and each company has its own policy on what they want you to use and which version. They will issue one to every pilot, and that is where you can update things like the charts. So they're flying always on instrument flight plans. So regardless of the weather, they can get from A to B using that, and you have to carry special charts to help you navigate with those. And so picture having again that suitcase down into one iPad. And by the way, those need to be updated every few weeks, and those updates can be done very, very quickly when you have the iPad. Imagine just having the whole world at your fingertips for navigation. That's really amazing.
So iPad is not to play Temple Run?
No, I'm sure some some pilots have snuck that onto their iPads, but to have that for aviation use only is something that is very, very common. So charts is one use.
So is it legal to fly with an iPad?
Yeah, the FAA has really come a long ways in recent years in starting out being very, very strict. I remember when these first started becoming popular because now there's some really powerful apps where you can keep maps and GPS backup and all that. They were very, very strict about saying, well, that can just be a backup, but you still need to have a primary form, a paper map, all the books and charts with you. You can't just fly around with a portable device if it's not actually installed as a certified unit in the aircraft you're flying. And it's evolved to now where you can actually use those charts in an iPad or an iPhone legally, even if that's your only source. Now, most people think it's a good idea to still have a backup, whether it's something in the aircraft or in another portable device. But that is one reason why this is so revolutionary.
But when I get on an airplane, in the back of an airplane, they typically say, well, the doors have now closed, therefore it's time to put it in airplane mode. What happens? Do you put it in airplane mode?
You can put it in airplane mode, and a lot of that information is already downloaded, so you don't need internet or Wi-Fi to get a lot of that information. And it really depends on what you're flying. If you let's take it down to ground level. If you're flying a drone only up to 400 feet, you're going to be using that device as your GPS, as your altitude indicator, your speed indicator, and you are going to need a cellular signal to do that. That when you're up in the air, there's a certain altitude where you're going to lose those signals and you may not have Wi-Fi in the aircraft if you're flying something smaller. So all the way up to the airlines, they are still useful even without that.
Yeah. So the other thing is, if you're sitting in an airline, which is made of pick a metal tube of some kind, and they block some of this cellular signal. So even if you could see it, as you said, as you climb, you're going to lose that. But the nice thing is there are devices, portable devices that can pick up these signals. In a previous episode, we talk about radio signals and GPS signals. There are devices that can pick it up and then send it to iPad. So your iPad becomes where you view it, but not necessarily how you connect to the world of satellites or radio beacons.
Yes, and that's another reason why the iPad is so useful because when you are in a large jet or like an airline, you're generally going to have Wi-Fi all the way on up that will never get interrupted. But you're something single engine, something smaller, and you're only in that 3,000 to 6,000 foot range. You can lose a signal, and so there are devices, and those companies have tagged onto this iPad revolution that you can charge up the battery, put them in the aircraft, and they can pick up GPS signals and help you make full use of that in the air.
Yeah, so there are some devices, tablets, which are Android based, and some companies have developed apps, but it tends to be majority or primarily iOS devices or iPad. That's become sort of the de facto standard, more or less.
Yes, it has been really interesting to see that this started out in terms of the portable device revolution. It started out with a lot of variety and some aviation dedicated devices that kind of look like a tablet or an iPad. But in the end, I think with the users out there showing their preferences, it is true that the iPad and the iOS devices have won out. Probably because the apps that are being used are really, really usable, easy to update, and don't have as many problems as other devices. And so that brand has actually become the top use from, again, airliners on down.
Yeah, we should mention that there are Android apps and things that can run on Android tablets, but for some reason, Apple based products tend to dominate the aviation world.
So, how many ways do you use your iPad or your iPhone? And do you use it for anything unique? Tell us your stories in the comments.
Elaine, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, but I used to be an Android guy. I had Android phones for probably like 15 plus years, and I switched to a Apple phone only because it was easier to use device like an Apple device, an iOS device, primarily for aviation.
That's something that's happened to a lot of people. I have devices from both manufacturers, and it just turned out through trial and error that with flying, the iOS devices have the easiest to use and the best apps that are out there.
Yeah, so one of the apps that I know I use and it's very popular, it's not the only app, but it's very popular, is called ForeFlight.
That is probably the most common aviation app that's used worldwide on mostly the iPads because it is an all-in-one app that has grown since its inception, and I believe it is now owned by a very, very large, well-known aircraft manufacturing company. And at this point, it can do everything. It has backup flight instruments, it has GPS, all the charts, maps for air navigation all around the world that you can update. It has weather when you're up in the air flying. It has traffic information, which you can also receive via GPS signal. Everything, and you can use it to plan all of your trips. It has all the airport information again around the world, and so this has become the most popular aviation app on these iPads that everybody uses for everything else.
Yeah, I got to say that I've become almost addicted to these apps, right? It's let's say you're flying previously, and we mentioned this in a couple of other episodes, that you had to do a lot of what we call as pre-flight planning. You got to pour over the maps, you got to plot it, you got to figure out what is the frequency, you have to figure out what the runways are there, which direction to land, all those things. Now with the advent of iPad and apps like ForeFlight, and Garmin Pilot is another very popular app, and what's that has given us is, I'm not saying that you should not plan ahead, you should, but now on the fly, you're able to get information a lot more readily than previously.
Yes, that is great, and it is really handy if you have to do something unplanned, like land at an airport because you see that the weather is getting bad. Before, it was a little hard to get all the information for what was available at the airport, and even runway lengths you had to carry in paper books. And if you happen to have forgotten that book or had it outdated, you were out of luck. And so, having the iPad so updatable on a daily basis has again revolutionized flying because you can have all this right in front of you in the cockpit.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning that if you're flying, let's say, longer distance, let's say 200 miles, 300 miles or further, you have to carry maps, all these maps, right? And so with the iPad, you can now do that a lot more simple. So yeah, it's literally revolutionized flying, no question, across the board.
It's amazing how common it is too, and flying all different kinds of aircraft. But that brings us to a couple of downsides that we need to just be aware of when we're flying every day with the iPads. You'd mentioned having long trips. Well, they are battery operated, and so to have portable chargers, to have aircraft installed chargers is something that can easily prolong the life and get around it. But then you have to remember to have chargers. I've had chargers stop working in the airplane, and so you have to have backups for those. Portable batteries and anything that you need because they don't really last long when they're running constantly like that.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially when you have display and if you're flying out in bright daylight and you have the display turned up high, it is totally possible for the iPad to run out of charge much more quickly. It's not that different from you having to charge your phone every now and then in day-to-day life. But the other downside is these devices can fail for whatever reason. It can just stop, things can crash, things can break. So you got to anticipate all those.
Oh, definitely. And have you ever had your iPad or your iPhone overheat because you've got direct sunlight coming into the cockpit? So it's hard enough to see that screen when the sun is so bright, but that can literally cause it to overheat. And by the way, if you haven't had that happen, it blacks out the screen and just says over temperature. You have to wait before you can turn it back on. So you have nothing at that point. And so this is why backups are so good.
Yeah, that is true. So the devices can break at any given point, and you got to be really careful with that. And that's where backup devices, or better yet, maybe backup paper charts and paper information. At least the critical information is very important.
A lot of pilots are still really adamant about carrying paper backup charts because, like they said, they can't overheat, they can't break down, and they're always there for you. So it's pretty smart, especially if you're traveling frequently or long distances, to have that. With the batteries and the chargers, there's a few failure points that you're introducing because I found that you really can't go more than an hour or so running full speed on the iPad in
So
terms of the battery life.
the other thing that maybe it's not very obvious to non-flyers is that, and you mentioned this, that you have to update these databases very frequently, sometimes every 28 days. So let's think about what happens if you didn't update it. And so it may not be safest, it may not, it's certainly not legal to fly with an out-of-date database. So if you, let's say you packed your iPad, but you forgot to update it, it is possible that, at the very top, you're flying in an illegal uh, database. But worse yet, things could be unsafe because there could be a terrain update or a tower update or a runway closure update that you may not have information because you didn't update it.
That's a really good point. You have updates that are happening all the time, either on an hour-to-hour basis where, okay, there's a runway closed for a while at an airport. If you don't know about that and you're coming in, that could cause a lot of trouble. Or like you mentioned, towers. They come up and come down all the time. They seem to be getting taller and taller, and it's a really good idea to have those updated because you never know.
Yeah. So the other thing is, um, airports, even the government, disseminate information, sometimes real time, on airspace closures, temporary restrictions, airport construction, all kinds of stuff. Now, if you have an iPad, you're receiving this much, much more real time. So you're much less likely to do the wrong thing, either regulatory wise or safety wise.
Yeah, that is great. If you are hooked up to get a signal on that iPad while you're flying, you will get those notices up to date by the minute. And the same thing happens with weather. There's a very we'll call it a very basic weather radar you can get. Now, it doesn't show you live real time like the radar they equipment they have on airplanes like airliners, but it will give you some idea of what's ahead or where the thunderstorms are moving, for example. And so that's another caveat too, is that even though we've come to depend on these, you still have to be able to look out the window and plan ahead to make sure you're not deliberately going somewhere where the weather is bad.
Yeah, and we mentioned that you can now use iPads legally, but in most cases, you must have the primary navigation built into your airplane, whether it's GPS or some sort of radio navigation, for you to be legally flying that particular route.
Yep, definitely. And we had an episode on flight instruments. You still have to have those all operating on your aircraft as installed. And while the iPad, as via ForeFlight and other apps offer backup flight instruments, they're only supposed to be for emergency use.
Have you ever sat next to a pilot in an airline flight, or maybe you've seen a pilot carry an iPad and you're wondering what it is? Share us your story in the comments. This program is for information and entertainment purposes and are not meant as flight instruction, legal, or medical advice.
This is